Hello, I'm Bob Gorley, the Chief Technology Officer of OODA LLC. This recording captures content from our 18 October 2022 OODAcon. OODAcon was an event designed to bring together people from our community to talk about this age of exponential innovation and disruption so we can all learn how to better survive and thrive. This session is about the future of requirements. One thing we have all realized in the enterprise world is that it is hard to identify the next generation of technology requirements because technology is moving so fast today. So who better to help us examine this than this panel? Neil Pollard, a long-term friend of OODA. Previously, he had been a senior executive in government and also a global CISO at UBS. He's a partner at E&Y right now. Bobby Stempley has had a long career. She was formerly the director of the U.S. CERT. She was also previously the director of the Department of Defense CERT. She was the CIO at DISA. She also helped stand up the transition of cyber missions at the Department of Homeland Security. Today, she's a vice president at Dell. The panel was also joined by Bill Spalding, an associate deputy director of CIA for digital innovation. Have a seat, folks. And ladies and gents, we're going to transition right into our next panel, and as you probably saw from the agenda, we've saved some really important topics for this esteemed group. Let me do a brief introduction, but first let me tell you the kind of things we're going to be talking about. How do you take all of this massive dynamic change that's occurring, all the incredible technology that's being built, how do you comprehend it and then figure out what to bring into the enterprise or not? Are there frameworks that can help us deal with this? Who could answer such hard questions? Well, these guys can help us understand this. I'll give you my brief view on who these people are and then let you all give the truth about your bio. Bill Spalding, I worked with maybe a decade ago in government. He was leading enterprise IT capabilities for some very sensitive and important counter-terror missions. Now he's a senior executive leading large portions of the enterprise IT at CIA. Bobby taught me how to use the command line back in the day. She was head of the Department of Defense CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team, during these major events of the mid to late 90s, attacks like Moonlight Maze. She was helping lead the DoD response to that. From there, she was CIO at DISA. She was worked at Department of Homeland Security, standing that organization up in their security capabilities. Went on to lead major security functions at MITRE and at the Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute. And she has been now an executive with Dell, and through that all, she's been engaging with the community. So I think you all know her pretty well. Neil Pollard, as Matt mentioned earlier, was co-author of this famous paper, In the Age of Digital Terrorism, Can You Trust Your Toaster? How prescient can you be to write something like that in the mid-90s, way before terms like Internet of Things were coined? He's a lawyer and a good one, so don't argue with him. And he's had time in government and industry. He's worked as a CISO and a consultant to major organizations. Now, that's my view of you guys, but let me start with you, Bill. And would you please give us your version of your bio and then pass it to Bobby and Neil?
Thanks. That was very accurate. Thanks, Bob. Thanks for inviting me to talk. I think the only thing I would add, I'm in a directorate that's kind of new at the agency. It's called the Directorate of Digital Innovation, and you'll kind of hear an influence of that in a lot of the remarks that I'll make here today. But basically, we were formed just over 7 years ago, which was kind of a big departure for the agency to bring a lot of capabilities that were probably suboptimal related to all things digital, and now we're really harnessing them.
Awesome, great. Bobby?
I guess the only thing I would add or change is that I think I've made a career out of arguing with you and Don and Neil and many, many others, because arguing is, I think, one of the most important skills we have. It really helps us refine all kinds of things. And so I've had this really unique experience of being in the public sector in government, in a range of execution and executive roles, in academia and non-for-profits, in a range of sort of leadership and executive roles, and now in industry, in sort of thinking about what that all of that is.
Great. Thanks, Bobby. Neil?
I just want to follow on with what Dawn said about not being able to hold a job.
Yeah.
That I've had a very varied career. I've been in government. I'm an adjunct professor. I've been both a consultant and a CISO for a very large global Swiss bank. And my career has been defined by things that I find interesting and fun, hard challenges. Some of the most rewarding things that I've done in my career was as a contractor working for DARPA, which I think speaks exactly to the direction that we're going with this panel. But I also did some very fun things with the intelligence community, and have moved jobs though quite a bit.
Well, let's get into some questions for these guys, because they are all deep expert and they're tracking these many dynamic factors in the environment. And one is there's so much innovation out there. You guys see all this, and innovation in multiple fields, from sensors to analytics to databases, cybersecurity innovation. It's really impossible to track nowadays. Now, 10 years ago, maybe it was hard, but you could do a market assessment, figure out what's out there, get some budget for it, buy the thing that may meet your needs, get some staff for it. You can move. I mean, it's hard. I don't mean to oversimplify it too much, but it's got so hard. It's just tough to keep up with now. If there's 3,000 venture capital funded cybersecurity firms, for example, 500 of which will have a demo at the RSA on the expo floor, you can't even comprehend that. So how can an enterprise IT professional really smartly comprehend what's going on in cybersecurity? And then just to make it an even harder question for you guys, that's just one field. If you talk about AI and machine learning, it's 2,000 firms that you really need to have an awareness of before you start making procurement decisions. These are impossible tasks. Or are there any frameworks that can help enterprise technologists track these kind of things and make appropriate decisions? Bill?
Well, I think in some ways we're starting to rebuild a lot of the relationships, and we're encouraging folks to get out and explore in forums like this. These had been kind of gone to the wayside. Get closer with academia, get closer with all the different organizations that are nurturing the technologies. You saw some of them on Dawn's second to last chart. A lot of those we're pursuing. And it's interesting, when I talk to folks, they're having to rebuild their networks, which I know sounds trivial, but just a lot of the interaction has, take away 2 or 3 years, things went dormant. So you kind of get out of the loop, and it is kind of hurtful. Another thing is asking. And I think we in the government need to do a better job of asking you in industry and academia to help us, asking in a way that's useful, that you can respond. And so we're experimenting with some new vehicles for that, and I think that's one of our, maybe hopefully the edge of a breakthrough. We have a new vehicle for a broad agency announcement that we're calling Digital Hammer. Some of you may have heard of it. And it's really our attempt to try to get quickly to industry, ask you some hard problems, some hard questions, see if you can solve the problem, give us the results quickly so that we can make some decisions and move on.
Digital hammer, and am I the digital nail?
Yeah, exactly. You can think of the coins, right, that we built with this. But then the last one is just tinkering. We need to do more of that inside the government. Quickly test these ideas that are coming out of industry, test them in unclassified areas, and try to just see how quickly they can be adapted to real mission problems.
I want to come back to some of that, but Bobby, do you have any context?
Yeah. So the amount of information that exists is truly overwhelming, and as we've heard all day, the future is never going to be simpler than today. And so the two things I think are true, though, even within that context, we are each the experts in our problems. And so we can talk about sort of a framing for how we understand all of the inputs, and there are lots of people who organize the market in particular ways, and you can read this analyst report or that one or this technology report. But unless you're an expert in your problem and your domain, there's no way for any of that information to sit. So I think that's job one. Job two, and this comes from a lot of painful experiences that I'm sure you've experienced as well, is we have to think about, particularly when we're talking about public-private interactions, right, between working with governments at state levels and the federal level, we have to separate the method of engagement and procurement and delivery from the message of what it is, what the problem is, what the opportunity space is, what the solution is. And I find that we confuse those two a lot. And yes, the method can limit the message, the ability to implement the message. I agree. I'm not saying that you should ignore them, but you really have to disambiguate them. And if you don't, you can't have any kind of meaningful partnership and relationship model that helps you work your way through these problems.
Neil?
One of the things that always struck me as kind of funny during one of my many career changes was, so the first part of my career was really in the counterterrorism community. I did use a lot of technology, but also did some operations and planning, that sort of thing. And including some work for Bobby back in the day at DISA. And when you're in government, when I was in government first as a contractor and then later as an officer, you always hear, we need to talk to and I totally agree, but the government definitely needs to understand and talk to the private sector. Mm-hmm. And there was an admiration that the private sector's got this, they got the technology, they got the efficiency, they have the money, they have the management. Then I left the government, went into the private sector, and they're like, oh, you came from the government, especially the intelligence community. Wow, they've got all the money and the technology. Like, wow, I got some bad news for the entire world here. And I do think that there's always value in both of those talking to each other, because there are things that one side does better than the other, and vice versa. One area that I think the U.S. government is particularly effective at, especially the Pentagon, is defining requirements. I mean, the PPP, the requirements generation and resource allocation process of the Pentagon, which filters all the way from, to get into the vernacular 6.1, if it's still called that, all the way out to initial operational capability and everything in between. What does the warfighter need? And they have a disciplined system to extract that out, to make sure, as Bobby said, that these are experts in the problems, not I need a widget. I need to execute this mission, and therefore I need this capability, I need this process, I need this outcome. And it's a well-defined, at least it was when I was in that field 10 years ago, it was a very well-defined process. I think the challenge with getting your arms around the innovation ecosystem, it's not pockets of innovation anymore, it's an entire ecosystem with all of these startups budding up, is the expertise on the problem is either not there or it hasn't been refined to communicate these are the requirements of the CISOs, the new warfighters, to use another Marshall metaphor. The private sector doesn't do that very well. And you do have a lot of technologists and CISOs who say, I do want the widget, rather than this is my problem. I want to stop malware from beaconing to the outside. I want to stop lateral movement of malware and adversary. I want to stop the uncontrolled hemorrhaging of data out of my environment. And to do that, I need to be able to do this, this, this. And then, like the Pentagon does, except on a much, much larger scale, articulating what those requirements are to the development community, to the innovation ecosystem. And then, and this sounds very simplistic, because right now I don't know how to do it, except to follow the money, go to conferences like this, remain connected to networks like this, and when either say to another CISO, whoever, I have a problem, and they refer me to a solution, or call Bob or call Bobby or call anyone and say, have you heard of this company?
But I think I would argue with, or I would add on to your final comment, and that is that there is real power in connecting the innovation and development community with the operations community.
Absolutely.
And so, I know you didn't mean it to sound siloed,
no.
but I need to really reinforce the fact that the fewer of those silos we have, the better off we are.
Yeah, absolutely. At a certain level, you can't get away from the silos because
Sure.
You don't want engineers on the battlefield necessarily, and you don't want Navy SEALs in the engineering lab necessarily, unless they've both been trained in that sort of thing. But bringing those two together, I think, is absolutely spot on how you do it. And again, not to keep going back to the government, the way they did it was through the requirements generation process to say, warfighter, or the equivalent of warfighter, what do you actually need?
Well, now, if you open up a database like Crunchbase, which tries to track all tech firms, or CB Insights or others like that, you'll find there's 100,000 firms that have capability in there. So maybe you pull it by sector, and it's like, okay, I'm only interested in machine learning over this kind of data. Okay, that's only 10,000 firms. So that still doesn't really help you do any kind of market research other than to say, here's a universe of 10,000 firms that might be able to help me with the problem. And I just mention this because it's such a thorny challenge that we haven't figured out how to deal with. The way I think government's got a lot of thought in this, and the government's able to go to companies like Carasoft and say, who do you have that in this vertical that does this thing? And then they narrow it down, and like, here's 12 companies you might want to pick from. But that's still just barely touching the universe. And I worry that it's all of this is suboptimized. Will Digital Hammer help fix this kind of thing?
It already has shown some very promising signs. So, just to your point, we would launch RFPs or whatever, and it was the usual suspects. That would. I shouldn't have said that. There's probably usual suspects in this room, so I should be very, very careful. And we just basically would have very predictable outcomes with a lot of the solicitations. With Digital Hammer, I think the number is 29. 29 states. There's people representing 29 states have become part of the conglomerate. So that's very different for us. I know that's very small in comparison to probably the Department of Defense, but for the agency, that's rather significant. So I think it's off to the right start. It's kindling some energy and some interest, and let's see where it goes.
Cool. I wonder if there's things you're doing there that business could learn from, and by business I mean non-IT guys. Like, could Procter & Gamble check out what you're doing, and maybe they want to implement the same process because they also have problems in figuring out what's available out there. Possibly.
But I'll be very honest, we stole it from NGA and DefenseWorks. They had, in fact, at a conference recently, I admitted when I got a question about doing things faster and everything, and in the agency we had, to our defense colleagues, we always would say is that we have OTA envy. We wish we had other transactional authorities, the ability to really define things real small, put them out very quickly, get responses. We didn't exercise our authorities that way. This BAA is our first time to really go into something very, very different. And so I guess the advice I would give industry is keeping it really small. Makes it winnable.
Great. Another thing, a point that this makes, the way you said that, is what Neil was just talking about, which is we need to build networks of people and be able to ask, what's your opinion? Do you have processes I can borrow? That kind of thing.
I think one of the things that has been immensely successful but rarely used in the technology space is the idea of grand challenges. Right? This idea where we're not asking people to necessarily register with the government in some way of their interest, but we're saying, and we're not being overly prescriptive of which sector is going to answer, but we're saying we have this problem, and I think what you've heard across all of us is it's worded as a problem, right? We're not bringing a solution. We're not asking for a specific solution with a lot of prescription. We're saying we have this broad problem. Bring your innovation into it, or see how your innovation applies to it, and that's been really successful in a whole range of ways.
Exactly. Another factoid. So Matt and I were doing some doodling on the whiteboard and capturing info on what we're seeing when it comes to investment funds being stood up that specifically are saying they want to focus on national security challenges, and somewhere between $6 and $12 billion is coming this way on the short term. This is going to add up quickly, and I'm thinking, you could have investment funds of, about several of them. You add it all up, and you got like 100 billion people looking for innovation to invest in. I mean, 100 billion in dollars that where people are looking for innovation to invest in. Things are going to go crazy when it comes to building new capabilities for you guys. And if you don't start articulating your requirements for this in the national security space, especially, you're going to find they are driving the the conversation. They're going to be coming to you with solutions that you really want badly. I want that anti-gravity ray, even though I did not articulate it as a requirement. So it gets back to, again, stating requirements. And stating requirements the old way may not be as effective as it should be. So how do you state informed requirements in this area where there's billions of dollars of private equity funds will be invested in this hot, innovative world? Same old way?
No, I really think the way Neil captured it was right, that there is some discipline out there in really going after what is needed by mission, what is needed by the business, and capturing it in a way that we could, as you said, put it out as a problem, articulate it in a way that gets some enthusiasm, get some energy around it, and then get a response that you can quickly act on. And one of the other things, when I mentioned tinkering, I don't mean that in a joking way. I mean it very seriously in the sense that, yeah, you might have billions of dollars at risk, but if you could at least prove something out in the lab with mission players actually watching, participating, and giving you the feedback that you need about whether or not to progress to the next stage, that's really, really powerful. And we've begun to put some processes in place to actually do that, which for us is very, very, very different because this is on a much smaller scale than we normally would have jumped into. So could you scale that to the really big investments? I wouldn't be the right person to answer that, but to me, at least logically, it seems like it would be able to extend.
I think I'd say you don't want an anti-gravity ray. You want the ability to make something 100 yards away fly without its controller access or knowledge.
Yeah.
If you ask for an anti-gravity ray, that's what you're going to get. And maybe that isn't the answer. And so I think, I say that just to make the point that I think it's important for all of us as we're thinking about being expert, to our earlier conversation, being experts in our problem, to take a step back from the way we're reflecting it. Right? In the end, with every digital contract we're going to have, with every bit of decision support and filtering that's going to be on every database out there, and every review of a source selection and other pieces, and all this technological support that's there, what we're really needing is creative humans to describe the situations they're trying to solve in ways that they can collaborate with other creative humans, and then enable the system to achieve the outcome that they need.
I think you're spot on, and it reminds me of a Robert Heinlein quote. I'll have to paraphrase because I don't remember exactly, but Robert Heinlein said that innovation and progress wasn't created by early risers. It was created by lazy people trying to find simpler ways of doing things. So here's I'm tired of pulling this log, so here's a wheel. I'm tired of eating cold soup, well, here's fire. If you capture that, and again, I think it's in a little bit more disciplined process, then I do think you start getting a much more manageable aperture if you're the user of the technology to figure out what's out there, and a much more a deep sharing of the expertise of the problem with the producers of the technology, with the innovators, and articulating it as a user problem as opposed to an engineering solution is the right way to go. And I'll use one example of where I have seen progress, and OODA is square in the middle of this in the cybersecurity world, is the venture capital firms or the investment banks. The one I used to work for, UBS, the CISO's office was a constant advisor of the investment banking side, where the investment bank would look at portfolio companies and say, is there a there? You're an expert in this problem, Mr. CISO. I see lots of banks doing that. You've got a lot of venture capital firms that have literally people that their title is CISO in residence. And they're there to advise on, as experts of the problem, is there a there? In addition to questions that all CISOs should be asking of startups, which are venture capital questions. Who's your management team? What's your unfair advantage in the market? And what's your business model? What problem are you solving?
Yeah, it does get back to this concept of grand challenge, I think. So, for example, if an organization wants to connect multiple campuses they could say, I want new fiber, I want 10 gig Ethernet connecting all these campuses, and I want Wi-Fi 6 at the campus, and I want 5G for my mobile users. Or they could issue a grand challenge and say, I want to be able to communicate between any of my nodes at 10% less cost and 1,000 times faster. Is that what you mean by a grand challenge? And then when there's a solution, you give a grand reward to that grand challenge?
Essentially, yeah. I want to solve the one that was most striking to me, and I think it was USAID who released it, was they wanted to solve the problem of protective gear for Ebola, for treatment of Ebola, because you're donned in this big thing with this face mask. Nobody can see you. It's very inhumane, and people were afraid to come. And a wedding dress designer won the challenge because she understood sort of what it meant to make a very personal and all they said is, I want new protective gear to address this challenge, and I want to make the relationship between the provider and the patient more personal.
We could be onto something here, because what everybody does, every big organization, not just government but business, is you issue an RFI and an RFP, or you write up some other kind of procurement document that lists your requirements. Very few do this kind of grand challenge, and maybe that's the push we ought to be making forward.
Yeah, we certainly tried to make it in the Cybersecurity National Moonshot Goal. We articulated grand challenges as one of the key ways to try to solve some of the core security challenges.
And there's another aspect to the grand challenge I think is incredibly useful, is it brings technologists from drastically different areas of engineering. Mm-hmm. So, if you're trying to solve the identity problem, you may get some IAM people in there, you may get some network people in there, and grand challenges, I'm thinking the DARPA grand challenge too, are excellent at bringing in multiple disciplines of technologists that ordinarily wouldn't necessarily be in the room together, because they don't define what kind of an engineering challenge the problem is. This is not unique to information technology. Going back to the DARPA days of stealth, they didn't say we want to innovate in radar absorption materials. They didn't say we want to innovate in radar obliquing airframes. They said we want an aircraft with the radar cross-section of a marble. And then you have the radar absorption materials people come and the airframe people come, which hopefully they're in the same room, but you get my point.
Cool. All right, so this is something I'm going to capture as a key lesson, and we will definitely be writing about more on the site, and I appreciate that. I do want to keep asking you guys for other insights on how big organizations, not just government and business, can better cooperate and collaborate with the IT community that's building all this stuff. Any ideas, Bill, from a government perspective?
Well, partnering has always been a really important thing that, you might have influence from congressional input, you may have some other mission point that was pulling you together. But what I've seen lately is far more organic, where folks are coming together and partnering because somebody else has solved something that is most definitely extensible. And maybe the technologies 20 years ago weren't as open to sharing those kinds of innovations. Maybe now that we have far more ubiquity that allows that sort of transfer. But I've seen intelligence community agencies share on a scale in a depth of tools and algorithms and actual capabilities. I'm very impressed with what I'm seeing. So I don't know if there's an analog for that in industry that's useful, but in the past it was rather preachy to always tell folks you need to partner more, and you need to bring things together. I think it's a lot more voluntary and organic.
Yeah.
It's actually very hopeful.
Have you seen anything, Bobby, that would help us?
Yeah, I don't know how much this helps, but I've been sort of sitting here reflecting on conversations we had much longer ago than I care to think about, where we kept sort of talking about technology as technology, right? And what I like about where we are today is we've shifted from thinking about the technology just for technology's sake, but really looking across our customer, stakeholder, consumer journeys. What are the business processes? How is it enabling, how's this digital transformation enabling some set of outcomes? And then the technology evolution and integration happens. And so what I'm seeing happen in industry is moving to really understanding that the partner that you need is the developer, right? So it perhaps it is the CIO to some regard, but it's really not about having a platform for other people to do stuff. It's about figuring out what the developers want to do that and their tie back to their users, and then enabling a technology ecosystem together that does that. It has the downside, right? None of these things are ever easy and clean, right? But it has the downside of creating an immense amount of complexity in the worlds that we operate in, right? Nothing is entirely on-prem, even in your space any longer, right? And so you're managing this world of multiple service providers, multiple technology providers, and really expecting more out of the IT professional.
Yeah, and I've speaking strictly on the corporate side, I have seen a trend that is helping large corporations and management, possibly in government too, become more better partners with the technology side. And I like Bobby's distinction that I think she intended to make, which there's a difference between digitization and
Yes.
digital technology,
Yes.
right? Because digital technology
Much
is
better
technology, but digitization can Agile used to be a way to organize for coding. Now it is a management, I won't call it a fad because it's too early to say it's a fad, but it's a management concept of how HR should organize for Scrum teams and try and all the other stuff, all the terminology. Now what I've seen in the private sector, I'll give you a very, very tangible, very tactical example. Probably in March or April, there's going to be a new rule that comes in through the Securities and Exchange Commission that's going to require a bunch of disclosure, put public companies, not just banks, but public companies through a bunch of disclosure requirements, getting breached, cyber risk management, but also requiring public companies to disclose if they have a cyber expert on their board of directors. Of course, they don't define what cyber expert is, but we'll set that one aside for a different conference. Okay, so I'm not sure, reasonable people will disagree about whether it's wise to devote an entire public board seat to an expert on a fairly weighty but fairly esoteric operational risk type. However, what that is generating is the fact that there's a recognition now among the regulators, increasingly among boards, of something that the World Economic Forum found, which is 60% of economic growth is driven by digitization and digital technologies. Okay, if that much value creation is happening from digitization, then it behooves the board of directors to understand where that value is coming from and the risks to it, because that is the essence of the job of a public board director, which is to manage the strategy, which includes economic value generation through digitization and risks to it. So I think just that awareness, prodded along by some regulations here and there, are going to create better partners between CIOs and the board, because the board's going to say, digitization is accounting for the majority of our economic growth. Mr. CIO, can you please explain what in the world is digitization? Or Madam CIO.
And more importantly, or as important, not more importantly, and much better framing, thank you. What is our data? Why do we have it? What do we do with it? And who are we giving it to and for what purpose?
Yeah. And what happens if
Right.
things
Exactly.
go south, any number of scenarios that you want to put out there, bad and plausible scenarios.
Exactly.
Another thing I would love your comments on, all of you, is we're now in this age of great power competition, as we've all been talking about. It really is different now than it was 10 years ago. Many of us always knew there was a threat, a growing threat of great power competition. But today, it's different. And it seems to be causing some changes in attitudes in the American IT industry, the big providers of technology, including cloud capabilities. And I'm wondering, first of all, that we needed to think through new ways of cooperating with industry already. But now the great power competition is there. Is that going to change the dynamic? Bill, do you have thoughts on that?
It's absolutely true. So, it makes you kind of long for the Cold War in terms of the predictability. And the just the way things were carried out, including even our innovation during the Cold War. Now it's a different ballgame, and so the threat from the People's Republic of China is very real, related to all things cyber, and whether it's intellectual property, whether it's you know, any advances that I think even Dawn kind of alluded to, related to artificial intelligence, and you know, having the scale that they have to be able to go across all these problems and dominate, whether it's for military purposes or information purposes or political. We have not had a threat like that before, and this is something that is transcending not only government but industry as well, because the threats and the ways that your networks and your industries and your livelihoods can be brought down from these threats, you know, whether it's stemming out of Taiwan Straits or some other hotspot, it's very real. And so this is not a theoretical, you know, East-West confrontation. This is actually very practical and touches every industry in America.
Right. Well, thanks. And you know, I got a friend here who's in counter intel, and I tell you, those guys, all of them need like 10 times the budget that they currently have and 10 times the people that they currently have, because there's a big human element of what the hostile nation states are doing also.
Absolutely.
I want to start by saying that what I'm about to say is my own personal opinion, right? But
We probably should have started with that caveat for all three of us.
yeah. I agree with your question. I even agree with the premise of your question. But I think it's incredibly difficult today to separate out one cause for the whole range of things that are happening. Right? There is an awful lot of decision making in industry that has to do about human capital and getting the talent in. And it's shocking, to me it was shocking, maybe it's just because I'm old, is that the amount of time my 22-year-old son makes thinking about where he wants to work based on their ESG program. Right? When I was going to work, looking for a place to work, it was, will you pay me? Is the work worthwhile? Right? I mean, it was a very different conversation. And he's like, do they have an environmental and social program that aligns with what I want? And so that's having huge impact too. And they're interrelated, right? I can no longer separate these out and say it's the great power competition, or it's you know, your company is headquartered in this state, and I won't work for a company that has those kinds of policies. And so what I see from my time in government, from my time in academia and research, and now in industry, is that boards and leaders are trying to grapple with all of these changes at the same time and figure out what sort of the right bets to make within these situations are. And so great power competition is very real, but I also think it's a manifestation of all of these very value-based activities. And we've got to find ways to use all of our value-based efforts in the United States in order to counter it, not just one.
Cool. Neil, I want to shift the question a little bit in the interest of time, and that is, commercially, it seems like even the largest businesses are tightening up a little right now when it comes to their spend, because they want to get things under control. And the big businesses and the medium businesses don't have enough money to buy one of everything, and they don't have enough money and time and management talent to go with every cloud service provider to build their applications. They pick one. They pick, I'm going to build on the Google infrastructure, or I'm going to build on the Amazon infrastructure, or the Microsoft infrastructure, and that's going to be where I put my focus of efforts. And that comes with some great benefits of reducing complication, delivering fantastic capabilities for a reasonable cost, letting you focus, but it comes with risk also, including the risk of putting all your eggs in one basket, or the risk of being locked into that provider forever. And I wonder how this is improving the ability of enterprises to deal with this age of dramatically changing technology, or is it? So do you agree with the thesis that organizations are picking one provider, and does it help or hinder the innovation?
So picking multiple providers, I think, would help innovation, first of all. Second of all, some of the providers you alluded to are the large cloud providers, where I was just having this conversation like 20 minutes ago, where consulting companies make a lot of money because they'll buy the top tier license from one of the cloud providers. 2 years later, they're getting maybe 10% of services out of that giant license, so they need help in doing that, right? And that's not innovation, that's just activating your full license, because it is a very large, complex, it's only one cloud provider, but it's still a very large, complex ecosystem you just bought into, right? My experience is that, and I spend most of my time working with large banks, and most large banks I know of are not sticking with one cloud provider, they're going to multiple ones for different reasons. Some of it has to do with technical debt, some of it has to do with just decision making that I don't understand, and some of it has to do with different types of functionality and capability, depending on whether this is for the turrets of the investment bank versus wealth management versus commercial and a lot of PCI or whatever. Other banks, like in Switzerland, where they have to keep their data within the geographic confines of the Swiss borders. Don't get me started on data and geographical confines, but whatever. They went with the one large cloud provider that built a data center in Switzerland, because they couldn't go with AWS because AWS didn't have a data center in Switzerland, still doesn't as far as I know. So that made the cloud selection very simple. My point with this is there's still a lot of complexities in these decisions, and they build up and they build up and they build up. Then you get to a cost reduction phase or economic downturn or something like that, and like, okay, we need a cut. And the variables that went into deciding how do we get here are completely discarded for new variables about how do we wind down. And now you've actually, you're not saving money. You might save money next quarter, but not only you're not saving money in the long run, because you're going to have to redo all this stuff anyway because it's cyclical, but secondly, you might be introducing a level of risk you were not aware of because you don't understand what went into the decisions in the first place. And if decisions were made out of risk concerns, sometimes the risk people aren't brought to the table when deciding who gets the haircut. Now, that said, no one also wants to be on record as being the one who cut a CISO's budget right before an economic downturn, which also happened right before a hack. So sometimes the security guys and gals are.
Well, Neil, I think the big banks are going to have deeper pockets than a lot of other organizations. Most organizations, I think, will only be picking one cloud provider and building to that, I think. And when you do, that's going to lock you in and make it harder to change and be flexible. But to get back to our topic of innovation in this age of dramatically changing technology, maybe that's what you center your grand challenge around. If you pick Google, you tell folks, I need a solution that works with Google that does X. So you give it that caveat, or Microsoft, or Amazon.
Yeah, I'd also point out that even the large organizations, not just banks, but lots of industries, are still relatively early in their cloud migration path. Where they're still trying to figure out, are we 50% hybrid, 50% public, 50%, 20%? I'm sorry, my percentages are off, but you know my point. They're not there yet. And as they're going down that path, which is the larger and more complex the organization is, the slower that path will be. All these providers are innovating day on day on day. And they may end up using what they've invested in for totally different reasons they originally started off on the path. Again, those factors won't go into the haircut decisions during an economic downturn. And again, you're denying yourself value because you're trying to save money.
Cool. I have one concluding question to ask you guys. We're getting ready to transition to another panel. Matt, if the panel is ready. And this follow-on panel is going to be on canceling the apocalypse, which is a great topic. But I wanted to ask you a final question first, and that would be your final advice to the enterprise technologist who needs to try to understand where technology is going. Thoughts on that?
Well, I think we've kind of stated up here, getting the requirements right is always the right beginning. And that means a relationship with whoever your business or mission partners might be, a closeness and probably an art to being able to articulate what it is they're asking for. To me, it's been elusive. Yesterday I celebrated my 36th anniversary with the government.
You joined when you were like 12?
Oh no, I'm a very old man. But I gotta tell you, I just can't believe that many years later I'm still searching for this clarity of requirements and this ability to really capture the problem. So I can only imagine that is also transcending into the industry space, because the rest you do afterwards is probably formulaic as compared to that really important step. That would be the one thing I would leave.
Right.
I'm gonna answer it with a two-part answer. I know you said leave one thing, but I would say understand the rules. Don't see them as a barrier to what you're trying to do. Play the rule book, understand the rules, and build an incredible network of your peers, of people who you want to be your peers, and most importantly for me, of folks new in the industry who are coming at the problem from a completely different perspective.
Yeah.
Don't only have a network full of people that you've worked with for 20 years.
Right. Very good points.
I can't think of anything better to say than what Bobby just said. On the network side, I can't think of any better way to do it either. But also to your point about diverse networks, innovation happens in the margins of where our experiences don't overlap.
Exactly.
So make sure that you're surrounding yourself with people who have different experiences than you do, however you classify diversity. I can't think of any better way to do it or easier way to do it.
And be willing to argue with them.
And always be willing to argue with them.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, please thank the panel.